joining today's show is Congressman Dan Bishop of North Carolina's 8th Congressional District. He's a member of the House Homeland Security Committee as well as the House Judiciary Committee. Congressman, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Samantha. Glad to be with you.
Of course. Now, first and foremost, I was looking at your Twitter recently, and the cover photo is you holding up a shirt that says, "Hunter Biden is a crook, changed my mind." So to kick us off, can you tell me more about this shirt?
Yeah, that was a neat moment. It was, they changed my district around. We had gerrymandering by court in North Carolina. So I lost Robeson County, which is where that was taken, but President Trump was coming to the home of the Lumbee Indians in North Carolina, and they're just a fantastic community. But I was on stage, and they handed that shirt up from somebody in the audience to share, and so I made the most of it. But that you almost can't say enough in a short while about the significance or the seriousness of that issue, but it was also pretty funny.
Yeah. Well, we're going to dive into, the Judiciary Committee and oversight. But, just starting with Judiciary first, can you tell me about some of the progress that you have made on the committee during the last 2 months?
That committee has a lot of important responsibilities. The most important one for me is that in the speaker competition back in January, one of the things that the group of 20 that I joined negotiated with leadership was to have what some have referred to as a church-style committee, talking about the committee in 1975. As it's been manifested, it is the subcommittee, the select subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government. It is a subcommittee of judiciary. So Jim Jordan of Ohio chairs the Judiciary Committee. He also chairs the subcommittee. And in one way, it's hard even to get across how broad the task is of that body, because we see that the federal government, I think conservatives understand it. There's been this kind of, the government has been turned against the people. The government's assumed a responsibility and an arrogance and a brazen sort of approach to telling Americans how to live and what to think and what's improper to think. You've seen numbers of abuses, selective prosecution and bias that's fairly obvious in the FBI and the Department of Justice. So my biggest focus this Congress, I believe, is going to be on making sure that moves fast, that it gets as broad as possible. We get the staff that we need, and the staff is moving aggressively. So that's an everyday piece of work for me. Beyond that, the rest of the business of the Judiciary Committee, there are a couple things that come to mind that are extraordinarily, and they're by way of example, not by an exhaustive list, but we are already, we've had a hearing, public hearing on the border. The judiciary has responsibility over immigration policy, immigration and border security policy under law, and so we've got a big role there to make sure the American people fully understand just how dangerous it is to ordinary Americans all across the country to have an open borders policy that strengthens the international drug cartels and builds and gives the biggest opportunity maybe in the history of the United States to build a criminal syndicate in the United States with hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are so dependent and so vulnerable to that criminal organization that almost anything can be demanded of them. It's just, and it's funny, the left does that in the name of humaneness. It is the least humane situation the United States government could possibly create. So that's one. And then the other one that I will mention, and before we move on, I'm sure you want to have other questions, but everybody's heard of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the FISA court, which is supposed to monitor and put some guardrails around the way United States persons, or American citizens certainly, are scrutinized and have all their information collected and searched at will by the federal government intelligence agencies. And this year, part of FISA is up for reauthorization. And I know that Chairman Jordan, and I'm right with him on this, as with most things, Chairman Jordan is very concerned about the fact that the protections in FISA have not worked. They keep on building new processes, rules, and regulations, and they're habitually ignored. And we see that come out in Inspector General reports and the like, and no one ever seems to pay a price. No one goes to jail. Nothing ever happens to try to really tamp it down. And that's got to stop. So those are several of the things that are before the Judiciary Committee. We've got a full plate.
I wanted to talk about the border as well, and but specifically right now, and this is related to the border as well, with Secretary Mayorkas and his role. There's been these ongoing calls for impeachment. From your perspective, what other officials, in addition to Secretary Mayorkas, do you think have been maybe engaged in questionable activity worth investigating, and why?
So the thing about Secretary Mayorkas first is that he's just utterly flouted American immigration law. There really can be no serious debate that he has taken, and there's a laundry list of statutes that he has explicitly disobeyed. That is high crimes and misdemeanors. So we have these things you got to build consensus within a Republican conference. Some of who want to use a light touch on these things all the time. A lot of people say, well, if we aren't assured that the Senate will convict and it's in Democrat hands, why would we do any of it? There are reasons to do it, but we've got a process to go through, marshal the evidence, conduct the hearings in public, and if it leads in the direction and all the evidence adds up, and when you've done it in a real rigorous way like that, do you move forward with impeachment? I think so. Now, you asked the question, who else? You know, it's a matter of degree and political judgment when you exercise the remedy of impeachment, but it goes right to President Biden. I mean, and I think none of us are unaware of that. There are those who question whether or not it is a good expenditure of political capital to, for example, pursue an impeachment inquiry against President Biden. I can name a long list of things that he's done that are fundamentally unconstitutional. The vaccine mandate, the moratorium on I forgot what it was, the rent subsidies and the moratorium on landlords back in the pandemic that he extended. This thing he's trying to do now, entering into an agreement with the WHO, with the World Health Organization, that purports to be something that's like a treaty that would surrender American sovereignty and worse, state government sovereignty to this international body to decide how to react in a pandemic. It would be the opposite of what our experience would teach us should be done. So there are things that Biden has flouted law also over and over, and you can take any number of his cabinet secretaries and say the same thing applies. So I think the important thing about the Mayorkas one is it's the clearest, most obvious, most recalcitrant, most brazen examples of defiance of law in a role where he's required to execute law, with the results that are most dramatic, compelling, and destructive to the American people, the very fabric of our society. So he's a good place to start. Where it goes, I don't really say there's a limit to that. I think we should be prepared to take on whatever challenges are in front of us. And there's limited time and limited bandwidth, but you got to work every day. And that's what fighting is about. That's what Donald Trump, I think, taught the Republican Party, if we take the lesson, is that going gently through this is the country's at a point where it won't continue to exist as we've known it to be unless people have the courage to stand up, work hard, work really hard, and pursue things like this aggressively.
Well, I know it's been a very busy first 2 months, and it's probably only going to get busier. I wanted to talk more about what the committee is going to do moving forward to keep its promise to Americans who maybe feel powerless against their government or tired of watching the corruption unfold. Right.
Well, and that, you could pick any of the committees I'm on, but if that leads my focus back to the Weaponization of Government subcommittee. We're going to have a hearing next week with the authors, the journalists, Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi, who have brought to the nation's attention, and just recently, I think just a day or so ago, the Twitter files number 17 appeared. The mainstream media is assiduously ignoring them. Democrats like to suggest at this early stage that our effort is going to be partisan. It really isn't partisan. It is on behalf of the American people, And I think it will become impossible for them to ignore the weight of this when you begin to understand the depth of the ways in which the federal government has changed practices of our entire constitutional history. One example is since 1948 in the Cold War, when they first built American foreign, essentially propaganda efforts, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, things like that, there was a rule, there was a firewall. Those things could not, the State Department could not propagandize the American people. What we've seen emerge is that wall's been torn down. They spend all their time propagandizing the American people, and they've continued to build that kind of direction to the point that they go out to social media, and you have the Foreign Influence Task Force of the FBI, you have the Department of Homeland Security, CISA, all of these agencies. It got done in the pandemic where they take American voices off of social media. They send thousands and thousands of handles to Twitter to take these people down. It turns out they're not foreign sources in many cases. They're just Americans who are being swept up. That's the kind of action by the federal government. It flies in the face of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the relationship between people and government that was manifest in those documents. It's a complete corruption of how government is supposed to work. That's one example, but you see it over and over again. We've got to get our arms around that, show the American people, and then build legislative reforms. Frankly, there have been so many efforts to reform them. Matt Gaetz said on the stage here at CPAC yesterday, and I work closely with Matt, and I tend to agree, if we can't figure out a way that will actually solve this problem, we're going to have to gut those agencies. They've got to be reduced in size and scope. Their resources must be severely impeded, so they don't have the extra money to go around setting up censorship boards against the American people.
As I mentioned at the top of the interview, you are also on the Homeland Security Committee and the Border Security Facilitation and Operations Subcommittee. I understand you recently had a hearing here in D.C. You have a field hearing coming up in McAllen,
right.
March 15th.
Right.
So can you preview a little bit about what we can expect at this hearing?
So your listeners and viewers will hear from that particular additional point to this conversation that in serving on the Committee on the Judiciary, which has policy responsibility for American immigration policy, and also serving on the Homeland Security Committee, which has jurisdiction over the actual operating functions of border security, how the agencies that operate that, and we see the Border Patrol having been severely weakened and distracted by the open borders policy. Those things work really well for me to kind of have a fulsome presence in that area. With the Homeland Security Committee, I mentioned that Judiciary had a border hearing. That was in Yuma, Arizona, I guess week before last. So I did the Yuma hearing with the Judiciary Committee and immediately went over to El Paso, Texas with the Homeland Security Committee, Republicans who were there visiting with Border Patrol, the Homeland Security Investigations Agency representatives, the folks at Customs and Border Protection who operate the ports of entry. They call them the Office of Field Operations. So a lot of fantastic Americans who are serving the country extremely well. When we go to McAllen, though, I think it's going to be a continued process of exposing for the American people the ways in which the border crisis is not merely an abstraction of numbers, it is changing the very fabric of American society. I mentioned the one that seems most compelling to me, the fact that, I'll give you an example. When I talk about the Mexican cartels, people hear about that, the Sinaloa cartel. On January 5 of this year, there was a running gun battle between the Mexican army, and this is not the first time this has occurred, in a city of a million. I'm having some difficulty with the name, it's like Calicua or something, but it's a city of about 1 million, and the Mexican army went to try to arrest a fellow named Ovidio Guzman. He's the son of El Chapo. People have heard of him, so he's a cartel lord, if you will. And the cartel sent hundreds of fighters out, like soldiers. They ride around on what they call narco tanks. They're improvised gun-mounted pickups like you'd expect to see in a battle zone in the Middle East or something. And they're exchanging 50 caliber gunfire with helicopters and aircraft in the air. And that went on for a full day. There were burning vehicles blocking entrances to the city. People were hiding in their homes. If that criminal organization that has that kind of power within Mexico, which as Bill Barr accurately said is a failed narco state, if our policy in America continues to build and build and build the strength of that cartel, $15 billion in fee income they get from people who come across the border. The Border Patrol will tell you nobody comes across the border unless they pay those fees or contract to pay those fees, and they don't have the money. So they come into the United States dependent upon and at the mercy of that cartel. Build the strength of that criminal organization sufficiently, they'll be able to carry on the same kind of battles and warfare with American law enforcement, American even military, that they do in Mexico. So when we're in McAllen and we're having hearings on that, we're going to be talking about those kinds of phenomena, why they are a danger, not just in El Paso and Yuma, but in every community across the country. And we'll be talking about how this was the decided course of Alejandro Mayorkas and Joe Biden and why there's got to be accountability.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. Just before we go, I wanted to give you the opportunity to give any final thoughts.
I think your questions have given me an opportunity to talk about what is at stake and how big the tasks are that we confront, and to let people know. Here's the thing that I always wanted to know when I was out in the public and hoping congressmen were doing something. I wanted to know whether somebody was going to get off their butt and fight. And that's why I came to Washington. That's what I am doing, and there are many others of us who are doing the same. We're going to keep working for the American people to restore this country and their fundamental constitutional rights.
Great. Congressman, thanks so much.
Thank you, Samantha. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you as well.